There are a lot of different people who are or organizations that are defining what it means to have a zero energy building. These are all ones that come out of the International Living Futures Institute. There are more. USGBC came out with their zero certification, and there are more coming. And so just to say that when we talk about zero energy, having these certifications is good. We need to know what they're talking about.
It's fitting that Commodore is the sponsor for this event because, like everyone in this room, we're committed to building a more sustainable and energy efficient environments throughout Boston. I'm proud to see also how my Commodore team, design team, subcontractors have all embraced this process throughout our projects and really gotten together to work as a team to bring the sustainability to these buildings. I'm pleased to introduce Amy Longsworth, who is the director of the Boston Green Ribbon Commission. The Green Ribbon Commission provides a forum for representatives of the private sector in the city of Boston to plan and act on opportunities, challenges, ideas, and requirements of preparing Boston to meet the imperatives of climate change. Simply put, their mission is to convene leaders from Boston key sectors to support the outcomes of Boston's City Climate Action Plan. Today, we take a deeper look at one of their latest reports on getting to carbon-free Boston and the role that building design and performance plays in this bold plan. And now I turn the program over to Amy.
It's another great day to decarbonize Boston. Thank you all for coming to this BSA, AIA, GRC, any one more alphabet soup you can pile on. But seriously, the role of you all in this work that we have to do for the city cannot be overstated. It is so important to have the expertise of the architects, engineers, designers, innovators on board as we move into what is going to be like a Herculean effort to reform the city of Boston in a carbon to use only renewable energy, make it very efficient, and electrify everything, which we'll talk about when we get more into the report. So the GRC is an all-volunteer group of 36 institutional leaders in the city. And when I say institutional leaders, it's people like the global environment head of Bank of America, the founder of the Barr Foundation. We have many people representing commercial real estate interests, like Brian Koop of Boston Properties, which is the owner of this building. And we're organized by sector. So the thing the sectors all have in common are they all own buildings. We have a commercial real estate sector, as I mentioned. We work with cultural institutions, which is a new and growing area for us and really interesting because, as you can imagine, they have quite a variety of buildings, many of which are hugely inefficient. We work with hospitals and the healthcare sector, and we also work with higher education, so Harvard and MIT. So that's a more campus buildings and also campus concept. And what we're trying to do in all cases is to convene, share best practices, and organize projects like Carbon Free Boston, all in support of the city. We sort of think of the city as our client. And the city's, you probably know this, but the city's two big efforts are climate resilience. How do we make the city safe and resilient to the climate impacts we know are going to come in the next 30, 50, 70 years, and also to hit the mayor's carbon-free or carbon neutral goal by 2050. So on Carbon Free Boston specifically, in 2015, Mayor Walsh and the other members of the Metro Mayors Coalition all signed a pledge for carbon neutrality by 2050. I don't know how much time lapsed, but the next thing that happened was a dawning realization that we had no idea how to do that. The mayor turned to the GRC and formally asked, there is a letter on the record, can you please help us? We went into gear and organized the project that became Carbon Free Boston. And it included It was a massive undertaking. We raised about $1.2 million from a variety of sources. We organized expert advisory groups, but the most important thing we did was engage with Boston University's Institute for Sustainable Energy, and 3 people there, Cutler Cleveland, Peter Fox Penner, and Michael Walsh, who is here today, who designed and managed this entire project. And I think it's fair to say it ballooned into something well beyond their original scoping expectations. Others on the GRC had input, as did the city of Boston, even though the report was ultimately to them, to us, to them, so we had final control over the content. Number of subcontractors participated. Arup on the building side, and Rebecca Hatchadorian is here today to talk about that. All ACEs and applied economics clinics focused on a companion report that is soon to come out on social equity. What role does that play, and how do we contribute to improving social equity in the city through the process of this transformation? We had a steering committee and many other people. Here are our funders, including what was interesting was the Hewlett Foundation. As you probably know, they're based in California. They're interested in national and global energy issues, but they saw this as an opportunity to demonstrate a whole new approach to city decarbonization. You can find the report at the Green Ribbon Commission website, the BU website, the city website, the social equity report, as well as the technical report with all the underlying data will be released on May 15th. And all of it is feeding into the City of Boston's Climate Action Plan update, which is currently in the process of being written and should come out later this year. And with that, I will turn this over to the content person, Dr. Mike Walsh, Research Assistant Professor in the Department of Earth and Sciences at Boston University's Institute and at Boston University's Institute of Sustainable Energy. And I will add, on a personal note, a fantastic colleague for the last 2 years. Mike.
This is a challenging space to I think, be in right now because of the large challenge that is in front of us. And it's great that the Green Ribbon Commission came to Boston University and our budding Institute for Sustainable Energy to really support academic, driven work, something that is, really grounded in sort of science, based knowledge, and sort of cutting edge methodologies that we think we're going to present here today. And it was really great to have that sort of vote of confidence from the Green Ribbon Commission and all the work that they did in sort of supporting this project and fundraising this to get it to the point that we are at today. So I'm just going to start off by saying I am actually a natural system scientist by training. I did my doctoral work in oceanography, but I cut into this area partly because the university that I was doing my PhD at decided to go carbon neutral back in 2008. And I had the advantage of serving as a student representative on the committee that oversaw that work. And that experience sort of changed my perspective on things. I was an oceanographer. I was focused on the oceans. I realized how important they are to our global ecosystem. I grew up in New England. I love Boston. I love sailing. I love our ocean community here. But what really, mattered to me was protecting that and protecting not only our natural systems, but the people who rely on them. And that's a lot of what our story is about, I think, today. And that's a lot of what we're trying to do here with our work in Carbon-Free Boston, is protect the people of the city of Boston and of the world. So this is a great photo, I think, for this crowd here, because it's focused on a lot of our iconic buildings from the waterfront in the city of Boston. But it's also very, I think, timely in that last winter, we had these massive flooding events in these districts. And this is climate change coming up along our shores right now. The ocean is getting warmer. We're getting these more extreme weather events. Sea level rise will start to creep up over the next, it's starting to creep up now. And it'll start to affect and impact Boston even more. So as Amy mentioned, the city has been working on, in partnership with organizations like the Green Ribbon Commission, a series of reports and a series of ways of trying to figure out how to manage climate change and its impacts on the city of Boston. and how to address and mitigate our carbon emissions and make our contribution to the global effort and lead in that global effort to get the city down to get the planet down to a level that can sustain itself going forward. But this slide right here shows some work that was done in the Climate Ready Boston report, which preceded our analysis, and this was led by some folks over at UMass Boston and a couple other consultants, in which they looked at the impacts of sea level rise on the city of Boston. And you can see that in this area where we've had a lot of development recently, our buildings and our built environment is threatened. This historic area is threatened by sea level rise and potential flooding. East Boston, an area with a lot of residences and socially vulnerable communities, will be challenged. And we will see this sort of creep up over the next 70 or so years to be potentially have a maximum of 7.4 feet of sea level rise. And we need to prepare for that. We need to prepare for those worst events. But we also need to think about this other aspect of mitigation, reducing our carbon emissions, cleaning up our carbon footprint, to better to ensure that the world does not reach this maximum possible extent of sea level rise. And so we were tasked by the Green Ribbon Commission to look at that other side of it. And we turned again to sort of a lot of the scientific analysis that has been done. And the state of the art data in that world is sort of compiled and reported by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which regularly comes out with a series of assessment reports every 5 or 6 years, assessing the science, assessing the potential mitigation pathways for climate change, and assessing the impacts of climate change on people across the world, people and economies across the world. And last year, they came out with a special report, global warming of 1.5 degrees centigrade. And that target was set about 2 years ago at the Paris Climate Accords. You might have heard of that big meeting in which all the countries in the world got together and said, hey, we're going to try to achieve this goal. Try to limit 2 degrees is the maximum we can target. We can allow ourselves, but we really should shoot for 1.5 degrees because we realize the impacts of climate change, whether it's sea level rise, whether it's extreme heat events, whether it's changes in precipitation patterns that causes agricultural stress and food system to collapse, food systems to collapse, will be minimized if we limit ourselves to this 1.5 degree target. So this group of scientists, and this is actually how I got into this space of modeling ways and pathways to get down to zero. I actually started to work with some of the models that were used to inform reports like this. And other scientists, not me in this case, but developed a number of different pathways using a whole number of different types of models developed by people at our national labs in the United States, at research institutions in Europe and Asia. And they looked at what would it take to get the planet down to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And basically everything that they looked at was these rapid, deep decarbonization pathways. Basically over the next 10 years, I should say, out to 2030, effectively cutting our emissions in half. And then between 2030 and 2050, slowly reducing emissions even more to try and get to net zero emissions by 2050. And you might notice here that there is a zero right here. And we cross that zero in a number of these pathways by 2050. And you might be asking yourself, what's happening below that? Negative emissions. Well, what that also means is we need to redesign our planet, redesign how we use land use across the planet to basically take up carbon dioxide one way or another and put it into the ground. Concepts of afforestation or carbon capture and storage or enhanced weathering, these are all negative emissions technologies that will get us, hopefully, to these targets and limit warming to 1.5 degrees. But for now, our focus needs to be on sort of this trajectory right here. And how do we get ourselves on that trajectory? Well, we focus on some of our biggest problems, and that's cities. And within those cities, that is our built environment. And so Boston, as one of the leading cities in the world for at least the past 250 years, has decided to take on this challenge as Amy described and try to get to net zero emissions by 2050. And so how they've been doing so far is actually somewhat good. They've been reducing emissions roughly about 20% from 2005 levels, not so much, but the one sort of dirty secret about this is that most of the emissions reductions that you see here in this graph has been driven by improvements in our electricity supply. So we've gotten cleaner burning fuels on the grid, we've got more renewables on the grid, more hydro imports. There's been a little bit of efficiency work in our building space, but most of this has been driven by improvements in the grid. And the other dirty secret is our transportation system, as you all know, is just a mess right now, and it's getting worse. And it's something we need to kind of keep considering in this whole discussion. And I will address it in my last few slides. I do want to focus on buildings today, but roughly the pathway that we're on right now, with the grid getting cleaner, given state policies, with some improvements in our transportation system, we do anticipate getting halfway there by 2050 if we keep on our current path. But we need to bend this curve somewhat significantly, and perhaps even more than what I show you right there, to meet those goals that the IPCC and other organizations have laid out. So how do we do that? We did this whole report, and we found out that the answer is really pretty simple. And it's 4 different things. It actually started out to be 3 things, but then we realized that we were missing a critical component. And these 4 things need to be pursued simultaneously. We need to reduce demand for energy and maximize energy efficiency. Electrify all activity to the maximum extent feasible. Use GHG-free fuels and electricity. And then also important as well, improve social outcomes via intentional action. We have, with this transition, the ability to really stress certain populations that are burdened right now, or we have the opportunity to make their lives better, improving social equity. And as Amy mentioned, we have the social equity report that will be coming out next week. It was a big part of our research and analysis in this whole project. As we studied the issues in the city of Boston, we found that these issues are very much intertwined. And you can't make this successful unless you pursue all 4 of these actions together. So what really defines this future? And we looked at it and we wanted to say, hey, a carbon-free Boston encourages growth. We see improving the built environment, improving the urban ecosystem as something to attract more people, more businesses to live less carbon-intensive lifestyles. When you live in the city, you don't need a car, or you don't need to use it as often. You're more reliant on public transportation. You can bike around. You live in smaller spaces. Your office spaces are sometimes smaller. Urban lifestyles are much less carbon-intensive than suburban lifestyles. And we want to, also make sure that we create opportunities for affordable housing. So with our new buildings that we are being built, and hopefully they're carbon neutral, we also want them to be affordable. We want to couple mitigation with resilience building. So that means with our buildings that we are building up and the buildings that we are retrofitting, make sure that they're both carbon neutral compatible, but also can respond to extreme weather events that will pop up even under a 1.5 degree world. And we'll certainly want to prepare for even something worse. And that will enable not only that resilience and that ability to respond to extreme events, but healthier homes, workplaces, and streets. I think of one thing that I found out through this whole process is a lot of our buildings are just not as healthy as they could be. And there's a lot of potential for improving that as well. And we want to do this in a financially effective way that strategically invests for maximum returns as well. So being cost effective and smart about that. And we look to a number of reports that the city has produced over the last couple of years to help guide us: Imagine Boston, Climate Ready Boston, Go Boston 2030, and the Social Equity Report, Resilient Boston, to help define this. Just a quick overview of Boston's greenhouse gas emissions right now. Depending on the year, it's roughly about 6 to 7 million metric tons of carbon dioxide that are being produced. Most of that is being driven, being driven by 3 sort of core sort of energy demands: electricity, petroleum. So that's typically and mostly the oil we burn, we turn into gasoline and burn in our cars, and the natural gas that's used to heat our buildings. Sorry, we've had a little font issue here that's sort of screwed up a couple things, but right down here, that's transportation. Down here, you can see about, again, this varies depending on the given year, but about 2/3 of our emissions are driven by our building stock. So that's sort of one of our biggest challenges here in the city of Boston. And it's especially a challenge compared to transportation is we're pretty, I think, optimistic about the future of electric vehicles. I don't want to say transportation is going to be easy, but it is. I think the challenges in our building sector are going to be much larger, and I think they deserve a lot of attention. And you know, you being here today really speaks to that. So let's talk about that for a little bit. We spent a lot of time, analyzing and assessing and inventorying Boston's building stock. And we broke it down to a number of different building categories depending on their use types, their structure classes, and importantly as well from an energy perspective, their age. So right here, we've actually broken it out by a number of different building use type classes. Office space, large multifamily, small multifamily, and single family tend to be sort of the big players in the building space. Right up here, you'll see that we have about 647 million square feet in our building stock. And by 2050, we anticipate about 122 million square feet of new construction being added onto this as part of our growth. And you can see roughly here that it's about 50-50 in terms of floor space between the residential and the commercial stock over here. That masks one other important element, though, and that is the number of buildings within each of these classes. There are about 80,000 residential buildings within the city, but only approximately 7,000 commercial buildings. Commercial buildings tend to be larger, of course. So it's these areas, it's these buildings that might be the lowest hanging fruit, might give you the most cost-effective places to take action in mitigating climate change and reducing emissions. But at the same time, to address equity and to address concerns about energy burdens to our low-income populations, we need to address these other 80,000 buildings as well. When you look at the emissions of these buildings, those stocks start to change a little bit. I think the most striking difference between these two figures right here is the difference between our existing, our sort of square footage in new construction and its greenhouse gas footprint down here. Much smaller proportional to the whole stock. So 85% of our floor space is existing buildings in 2050. But 93% of emissions will be from existing buildings in 2050. A lot of people focus on new buildings and net zero new buildings as sort of a decarbonization strategy. Yes, that's important. Yes, we want to limit the emissions associated with new growth, but the biggest challenge is going to be in the existing building stock. There's another element of time that is important here, and that's with the building vintage and age. So the darker blues here are sort of older buildings, and Boston is very old, right? Very old. Its buildings are very leaky, and as you can see here, we move down to these figures. Those blue bars get actually a little bit bigger. They're much more carbon intensive because they're so leaky. You got to heat them more right now. And then another point to take away from this is different building classes have relatively different carbon footprints. You can see here overall that the residential building stock has a much sort of smaller carbon footprint relative to its floor space across the city. Medical lab, industrial buildings tend to be the most energy intensive. That's why you see, even though they have a relatively small footprint in square footage, that footprint almost doubles if you look at it from a greenhouse gas perspective. So a lot of things going on here, and it was great that we had Arup in this analysis to help us sort of figure out how to mitigate emissions from this building stock. So we looked at a whole bunch of things with Arup's help, and we again wanted to focus on, or we kind of came to focus on this big question of what are our retrofit needs within the existing building stock across both our residential and commercial sectors. And if we keep on this business as usual case, which I mentioned, we really won't have that much change. We have one of the leading efficiency programs in the country. That's Mass Save. It's gone into our buildings and reduced emissions roughly, and energy use roughly by about 1% of a year. But that is not sufficient to meet our 2050 goals and to get to deep decarbonization. And we need to get ourselves off of fossil fuels. And that means electrifying as much as our building stock as possible. And if we don't do that, that carbon neutrality goal is unachievable. So we need to target deep retrofit and electrification strategies, really try to get 40% EUI reduction targets across our building stock, eliminate fossil fuel use, and that puts carbon neutrality in reach. And we can probably, we could conceivably do this if we electrified alone. I will get to the limitations of that in about 2 slides, so hold that thought for a second. But one of our biggest challenges is touching all these buildings. And for that, we're going to need to, reconfigure how we regulate these buildings. We regulate our cars pretty heavily in Massachusetts. Got to take them to get a sticker every year. We don't do the same thing with buildings. And we need to start considering, new ways of trying to get our buildings regulated in a way that encourages them and drives them to get to these decarbonization emissions targets. And you see this stuff start to happen elsewhere. New York City is one example that has started to kick this off. But we see opportunities in both the residential and commercial spaces to use different strategies to get us to those goals. But we also need to build on top of that, or lay a foundation, I should say, of owner and occupant education, workforce development, and project financing to really support those aggressive policies and to encourage a lot of public buy-in to that. It's going to be hard to say to somebody, you have to retrofit your building if you can't give them pretty nice financing that makes it a good economic deal for that person. So I want to just turn and show a figure with hopefully Amy's permission from our report that's coming out next week. A little bit of a sneak preview on some of our energy equity issues that we analyzed in our social equity report. And energy for our lowest income populations, and sometimes that include some of our minorities and people of color, can actually be pretty burdensome as a proportion of their income. So this is energy burden, which is effectively the percent of your income that you need to pay for your utility bills every month. And the highest quartile in each of these groups is labeled in blue, but the medians are labeled in green. And you can see here that some of these census classified groups here are spending a significant portion of their income on energy. That means less money for food, less money for healthcare, less money for education. We need to figure out ways of mitigating that and lowering the energy costs to these populations. And that's going to be a big challenge going forward as we propose electrification strategies, as we propose deep energy retrofit strategies. How do we do that in the most cost-effective way? And this is still an outstanding problem that we could not solve, but we hopefully identified a number of these issues in this report, so people like you, people in the community, people in City Hall, can start to think about ways to do this in a cost-effective manner. And I think one of the big questions that popped up, and I will leave hopefully most of the design stuff to the people that follow me today, because I am not a design person. But one of the big questions that have popped up for us was, well, what do you do with our historic building stock? And my response to them, which is a little bit of a quip, but I say that, going back to that figure I showed you from the IPCC reports, we are in a historic moment right now. And our building stock is has been defined as as part of our history. And we need to look at this as a historic moment, as an opportunity to lay down, a signal to generations in the future that there are ways to that we value this moment. We see importance in making this energy transition. And these are just a couple examples that I found on the internet, just showing just different styles of buildings being retrofitted to be very close to passive or not. And I think there is opportunity to do this in the right way. And here's an example of a whole slab of brick being placed over another brick building, effectively adding a significant portion of insulation there. And that's actually a technology and approach that's being developed in Europe right now. It might not be applicable to all buildings, but we need to think about redesign, as a strategy for carbon mitigation. I mentioned electrification as an issue, and this is probably the most technical graph I'll show today. But right now, we use most of our energy as natural gas in the winter. This is this blue line right here. And to heat our homes. You can see this orange line right here is our electricity use at every day during the year, plotted out. And what's happening here in the summer is actually where we have a peak here in our electricity demand due to all the air conditioning that we use in our buildings. If we electrify our heating loads in our buildings, so switching from natural gas to air source heat pumps to electric boilers, what's going to happen is we're going to shoot our electricity demand up pretty significantly. That's going to have massive impacts on our electrical system. It's not going to allow us to use renewable electricity smartly and effectively. And it could really cost a lot to the ratepayer. So what we need to do and couple this sort of electrification as a decarbonization strategy with some sort of efficiency, demand reduction, deep energy retrofits. And if we do that, we can lower our electricity demand pretty substantially. And actually, if you see, we actually save electricity during the summer because we've insulated our buildings so well that they're not using as much air conditioning. We still have some peaks going on in the winter, but they're much more manageable in this sort of efficiency and electrification scenario. And we think we can tackle that with storage, behind the meter storage, maybe some smart district energy systems. But this shows that we need to pursue these strategies together. I may briefly want to talk about transportation because it is always on everybody's mind, and the importance in design in transportation. It really comes down to where people live. And this bar chart right here shows the emissions from our transportation system, with roughly half coming from trips being generated, mostly automobile trips being generated within Boston's and within the I-95 Beltway. But on a daily basis, because of all the commuters that we have out there, most of the emissions are associated with trips coming from outside of 495, outside of 95 and beyond 495. And that speaks to basically the suburban lifestyle that these folks are living, their dependency on cars. Yes, there's an opportunity for electric vehicles, but I want to underscore the importance of building cities that are welcoming, cities that have enough affordable housing for people so they don't have to live in the suburbs. Because the carbon footprint of walking and biking right now is zero compared to light duty vehicles, which is up here. And right now, ride hailing is much higher because for every ride hailing trip that you take, the driver is spending 60%, 60-70% of that time driving around looking for somebody else to pick up. So we need to tackle this as well, and it's all about designing better urban spaces to allow people to live in them. So overall, this sums everything up. This figure sums everything up. Our pathway for Boston to go to carbon neutrality. This is an illustrative analysis. The city will be coming up with their own as part of their climate action plan update process. But we wanted to show a couple of things, a number of things working together in tandem to get the city down to its goal of zero. So we start out with this trajectory that I showed from that first slide. And we expect that the green of the grid, as well as actions to electrify our buildings, electrify our transportation systems, get people out of cars and into biking and walking, and doing deep energy retrofits, all can actually get us pretty far down significantly. We can procure, as a city, more renewable energy on top of what the state is prescribing for us. And what we can do that either on a nice little straight path to 2050, or we can do that much earlier, which is actually what this stacked bar chart shows. And you can see the building's electricity wedge here, as well as our little small transportation and electricity sliver, basically disappear in 2030. And that's an alternative scenario where we show the city could procure 100% renewable energy by 2030. And you might have heard these commitments by cities and states to do that. And we find this to be actually really important. This line is great. It gets us very close to our goal by our 100% clean supply in 2050. But getting down and bending this curve by 2030 is critical for those deep decarbonization efforts. And it's roughly the only thing that will actually get the city below its goal for 2030, its interim target. And so clean energy procurement needs to, again, be part of that strategy. You'll see here that we don't actually get all the way down to zero. And we left some space because some technologies, such as renewable fuels, are still trying to get out of the gate, and we're still trying to figure out if they're relatively sustainable. We also will realize we might not get there. And we have a chapter in our report dedicated to the whole concept of offsets, carbon offsets. Because again, to get to those deep decarbonization goals across this century, so out to 2100, we need to spur a ecosystem where we can put carbon into the ground. And so it's important for the city to start to experiment. We might not find the solution right now with offset strategies that can develop either here in Massachusetts, here in Boston, or elsewhere, strategies to get negative emissions. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca Hatchadorian, who was the project manager for our building sector analysis. And did some great work supporting the Carbon Free Boston report, and she'll talk to you about that right now. There you go.
I am going to kind of dive in a little bit deeper into the building sector analysis, and talk, we're all in the built environment. What do we need to be doing now? Okay, so there we go. So first we wanted to take a quick step back and just put a little bit more perspective on this. So Arup has been working for almost a decade as a technical advisor to the C40 cities who helped fund part of this research as well, dating all the way back to our first report, which was the Climate Action in Megacities. It's now on version 3.0. And this is kind of the continuum of some of the work that we've all collaborated on over the years. But the one that we really wanted to set the context in is the Deadline 2020 work. So after the Paris Climate Accord in 2015, this piece of work by Arup and C40 was laid out the first set of pathways and roadmaps of what cities need to do to actually make that happen. It was a top-down approach, but it really started to lay out what is the magnitude, the pace, and the prioritization of action that needs to be taken. And so I've kind of scratched out the now in term from this report, because this came out in 2016. And one of the key findings is over on the right about action taken in the next 4 years. So by 2020, will determine if it's possible for cities to get on the trajectory required to meet the ambition of the Paris Agreement. And so the way we've looked at the Carbon Free Boston analysis is it's really the catalyst for Boston to start to take action. So as part of that work, we've also started to look at we've helped develop the methodology for consumption-based emissions for cities. So starting to look not just at the scope 1 and 2, but what is the value, or how do we start to quantify scope 3 emissions? We've also developed the protocol for assessing cities' climate action plans under the Climate Action Plan framework to make sure that those action plans are compliant with the Paris compliant, essentially. And so this project helped to bridge, it's really the nexus for us, so looking at our expertise in the building sector, as well as kind of that macro level climate action and mitigation from the top-down approach. So when we look at Carbon Free Boston and the work that we worked with Michael and the BU team on, it was really much more of a bottom-up approach, and what is the specific solution set for Boston? So when we do look at Boston's emissions profile, as Michael had pointed out, it's somewhere, the energy consumed by buildings represents somewhere between 2/3 and 75% of emissions. So it is by far the largest contributor to the city's emissions profile. And you can see here, this was the 2015 piece. There's kind of a somewhat even split between electricity and gas currently. And after the federal government decided to opt out of the Paris Climate Accord, the city's mayor upped our commitment and really stepped up and said that, no, we are going to be carbon neutral by 2050. And so how do we start to do that? As Michael showed earlier, the current trajectory out to 2050 doesn't get us there. And in that kind of wedge analysis, what you start to see are the two major blue bars. And And then the very tiny, almost not seen bar between the blue and the green is really what buildings represent. And what you see here is that it's really the light blue wedge, which is electricity that's on that trajectory. That's really what's declining. The rest are kind of staying more or less the same, right? And so that the value of that is coming from the state's commitment on the electricity supply. So we really do need to bend that curve so that all of those wedges, especially in the building sector, are starting to decline over time. And so as we've started to point out, buildings are the largest contributor, but they will be the largest part of the solution. And so what you're seeing is a kind of wedge analysis where we are in 2015. 3 steps over is what buildings represent in terms of how we actually get there. And this is the same slide that Michael showed earlier. And the focus has been, and a lot of the discussion has been on new construction, but existing buildings, they're the elephant in the room, quite frankly. So if we're only, we can't just focus on 15% of the problem. We have to address the other 85%. And so the value of the carbon-free Boston analysis is it was able to provide a level of granularity of what's going on in the building sector that we didn't have previously. So intuitively, we could have said, yes, we know that our medical, lab, and industrial buildings, they are disproportionate, they're heavy energy users. But we were able to quantify how much more. And so when this analysis and also all of our models have been turned over to the city as they're updating their climate action plan, they can be much more targeted and have a much better understanding as they're developing their pathway forward and what policies they're going to take. So we wanted to just take a step back in terms of there was a lot of analysis that went into creating this. And so we wanted to just very quickly tell you at a high level how we did this. So essentially what we did was take a typology-based approach. So we defined 15 building types that are representative throughout the city of Boston, which you see all the way to the left. There's 3 major residential types and 12 commercial. We then further segmented those building types into age ranges. And so all in all, there were 5 age ranges, 4 historical, and then what we were calling new construction. So when we wanted to account for growth, that's what that new construction typology started to look at. And then the truly ambitious part of this was trying to calibrate those models. So the utilities were kind enough to share some of anonymized actual data with our teams. And so for each of those 60 models, exclude the growth piece, we actually took that data and calibrated our models to better match the profiles that we were starting to see. So once we were able to do that, and that was a pretty Herculean effort, we had a set of calibrated models, and then we would then look to scale that up based on the square footage. So for each of those 60 models, how much square footage is representative in the city, and multiply that up to get a citywide energy profile and what that looks like. And then we recalibrated up at the city scale. So there were 2 kind of levels of calibration. And what that allows us to do is that when we do start looking forward and looking at those pathways, if we have a more sound and accurate model to be working off of, those projections or those interventions that we make will be more accurate as well. So essentially, we took those 75 models. We looked at a range of anywhere between 20 to 25 strategies of how we can either decarbonize or reduce energy demand in each of those building models. And then we had to go one step further because we're really looking at policy here rather than just strategies. So what type of policies need to be implemented to realize the strategies? Because policy is the means to achieve a desired outcome. So we not only took to define that, we took the strategy times the applicable building. So you can take a targeted approach to policy times an adoption rate. So not all, depending on the type of policy you crafted, it's not going to be adopted at 100%. So we had to account for that, as well as what kind of timeline are we looking to implement this over time. And so what that started to look like is 20 policies. So you can kind of quickly see for each one of those models, there was 25 strategy results and then further policy results. And so it gets pretty exponential in terms of how you start to manage all of that data. And so the thing that really enabled this was we used Energy Plus, which is a free open source software that also allowed us to quote unquote hack it. And so Python allows us to write scripts that then can run the models. So it took away the kind of manual nature of having to go into each of those 75 models and run all of that. So that allowed us to do, and we have a super strong computer processor with which to run all of this. And so the other part of this is separate from just being able to process all of this, you get a lot of outputs. And then making sense of all of those outputs, there's actually another script that we wrote around that's an optimization piece that can then help us process all of the outputs that came out of that. So that's, in very brief summary, the level of analysis, which we think is pretty one of a kind, that's been done in terms of the building sector. And so when we see those simplified graphs, there's actually a lot underneath that went into making that. So in the forthcoming technical report, we do have, how do these buildings improve? What are the specific strategies that really get us to where we need to be? And so as we said, we looked at a very wide range. So this is an example of a large multifamily building, an existing multifamily building. And what you start to see is the really large bars are showing there's not a lot of reduction. And so what we start to see is a lot of those incremental or just single targeted interventions don't get to the scale of the intervention that we need, very simply. And it's only when we start looking at very deep holistic interventions to the building, whether it's a deep retrofit, a passive house retrofit, and then when we look at it through emissions, that we really start to get to the level of reduction, not only in energy, but more importantly on emissions that we need. Okay, so the analysis kind of really provided a level of detail for the city as they're starting to update their climate action plan. But what kind of things would we start to see in the AEC community from a regulatory context? And what does this start to look like? So on the new construction side, we obviously have a state energy code and a stretch code. And there's, as you're permitting, there's the MEPA greenhouse gas process. And in existing buildings, it is still applicable to the state energy code, but only if you're doing a major renovation. And so a lot of the work in Carbon Free Boston started to look at what's within the city's power and how can they start to take action. So they have, this is for Boston and Cambridge, but they have green building zoning ordinances, as well as they both have energy disclosure ordinances that have actually, if you read all of them, it's not just disclosure, there is actually an energy action component to all of those. So those ordinances are trying to drive energy reductions over time. So on the new construction front, what this image is just showing is where codes have gone historically from 1980 to kind of present day. And you can see that energy codes have gone a long way over time. A lot of what has enabled that to happen is advancements in technology. So our systems have gotten much, much more efficient because they've been enabled to. So things like lighting, we now have LED lighting. That has allowed us to reduce the energy consumed by lighting significantly. Things, the advancements of heat pump systems, for instance, again, have come a very long way in a very short period of time. The thing that kind of hasn't changed a lot is how we are designing our buildings. So, for instance, we can still meet the energy code and be designing, like, for instance, all glass buildings, right? And so there's been advancements in glass technology as well that have helped enable that. But as we're starting to need to get all the way down, at least on the new construction side, it's going to have to the architecture and the systems need to both be working together more so than they have been. And there is starting to be a change in this realm. So there's a lot more attention being paid to air infiltration and how we detail our buildings on the architectural side, levels of insulation, and thermal bridging. Where are the weaknesses in our building envelopes? So what does a carbon neutral building look like? Any of these could be a carbon neutral building. And so the other thing that's important is we've been regulating energy use as a proxy for emissions to date, rather than using that as the metric. And they're not the same thing, because even in a carbon neutral future, buildings will still be consuming energy. We're not saying that they can't. It's the type of energy that they're consuming that needs to be carbon free. And so Michael did demonstrate the value of efficiency, though, when we look at it at the macro scale. So efficiency has a very, very important role to play. But the type of energy that buildings are consuming is just as important. So any of these buildings, depending on the type of energy that they consume, could be carbon neutral in the future. From some of these, the upper left is the energy E+, energy positive homes. And in the lower left is the distillery, which Gabby will be talking about, which is a passive house, the first passive house project in Boston. Multifamily, yes. And the other thing is that the timing of all of this is extremely significant. And so what this graph is showing is if we instituted a net zero emissions buildings policy in 2023 versus 2030, what are the aggregate impacts out to 2050? And you can see that those wedges that you start to see, that's a lot of emissions savings. So the sooner that we can act today, there are pretty profound long-term effects to mitigate those emissions over time. The amount of CO2 over the next 30 years that will not be emitted is pretty profound. And so all of us, as we're designing buildings today, we should start to have those conversations. We have a responsibility to have those conversations with our clients and thinking about what are the long-term emissions? Where can we start to make interventions and reductions today in the built environment? And on the existing building side, which is equally as important, if not more important, as we mentioned, our policy analysis, at least in Carbon Free Boston, focused a lot on how the city can look to augment BERDO over time. Since that is an existing ordinance, the fine print of it is that they do want an energy savings action every 5 years. And so this is actually the first year, I think the deadline just passed, it's like the beginning of May, for the first crop of buildings that were applicable to BERDO to start to report that. So the city is going to start to see how the ordinance has been performing over the last 5 years. And they've published, the website's actually great. If you go to it, and if you haven't, they have a lot of guidance around what an energy action actually is. So we were looking at, aside from augmenting BERDO, we looked at things like point of sale, point of lease. There hasn't been a lot of regulation around existing buildings to date. And so that's going to fundamentally have to change as we move forward. So we also wanted to just look at 2 quick case studies of what this kind of decarbonization and efficiency starts to look like. So we've been working with the city of Cambridge on their municipal buildings for the last 3 years. And so what you see on the left is I think it was completed in 1979 firehouse. And on the right, you're probably hopefully more familiar with, is the City Hall Annex building as well, which underwent a major renovation in 2000. So on the left side, for Engine 3, this was a building that we were engaged. Working in existing buildings is tough. It was October and the boiler failed, very simply. So the city is obligated to be providing heat to a building by October 15th. So we didn't have any time with which to completely change the heating and cooling systems in that building. So what we did do there was very quickly, so they could have heat for the winter, get a new boiler in with the long-term vision, because the cooling system had also failed, is that we would We have to supply heat, but we would then electrify the building and look at an air source heat pump type system in the longer term. So through 25A procurement, the city was able to work with a Eversource approved vendor, and we got the boiler in time for the heating season. We also then, concurrently, were designing to transition this building to an air source heat pump, and that is almost complete. The construction is almost complete. So while the boiler will still be there, it will not be operating under normal conditions. So this building will now be fully electric. And the city is also, there's been consideration of how they can also procure green electricity. So this building is quote unquote carbon neutral ready over time. So that's also just having to deal with reality. So if a boiler, you can't always do the right thing at immediately the right time. But it just took another 9 months to make that transition. And there's also a lot of incentives available for those types of air source heat pump systems. So on the right-hand side, City Hall Annex, as I said, it underwent a major renovation in the early 2000s. This building is already all electric. It has a ground source system in it. There are 3, originally they were open source wells. And they've been having a lot of problems with the building kind of ever since it opened. It's a beautiful building if you haven't been into it. And so we've been actually working with ICON and SGH to identify what's been going on, what's going wrong. So we've looked at things such as the envelope first. It turns out that the windows weren't quite installed as they were detailed to be. So there's a lot more air infiltration than was ever originally assumed. So the loads aren't balancing out. So the wells aren't sized for the appropriate load. So we've started to look at, well, what can we do to help seal that up, as well as repoint the masonry. The cost of that work is actually very expensive, but we have started to work it into their capital plan. So we're not just looking at the system side, we're also looking to address the envelope. On the well side, we're looking, since they're open source wells, we're looking at how we can convert the wells to closed loop wells, because we don't want to have to, this building is already all electric, we don't want to change that. But the maintenance of the open source wells have been a very big challenge for the city. So as we've started to look at that, we have to double the amount of wells, so they have to continue to drill here. Again, we've been getting that into their capital plan as a short-term fix, because there is a heating deficiency in the winter, especially on those peak days. We're installing an electric boiler to help manage not normal operation, but just those super peak, those 5 days in January where it doesn't get above 20 degrees. To keep, so it'll, again, there's always different solutions depending on what the building need is. But those are 2 examples of how we're starting to deal with it. So we can't just look at systems, we also have to look at the envelope. And Engine 3, there again is a longer term capital plan, many years out, but looking at roof and window replacements as well. So very simply, we wanted to kind of end on changing the trajectory dramatically. The further we can do, what we can do now, and there is a lot that we can do, so that we can tackle the harder problems over more time, so that the wedges do start to go down over time, all of them. I think there's a lot that we can do now, and I think please feel empowered leaving here. Have these conversations with your clients, internal to your firms. There is a lot that we can do to reduce not only energy, but the type of energy that is being consumed by buildings now. And Gabby's going to talk about passive house, which is a huge, there's a lot of potential there. So thank you, everyone.
Hi, everyone. I'm Meredith Elbaum with USGBC Massachusetts. We are driving sustainable and regenerative design, construction, and operations of the built environment. I'm going to build on some of what our previous speakers talked about. I'm going to talk particularly about the buildings. And it's interesting because I know you look when Michael was talking about buildings and that we're looking at existing buildings. We have to look at the new buildings too, because any new building that's built today that isn't built to be zero energy. This is someone mentioned this at one of the Boston roundtables that have been going on about these issues of how to meet the Boston goals as they develop their climate action plan. Any building that's built today that isn't zero energy is one that we're just going to have to retrofit. So we need to figure out how to do this. Not to mention, we need to focus on existing buildings, because any building that's built today that is zero energy, it's not zero carbon, because we're using energy to build those buildings. So one thing that we can do is not build any new buildings. I'm an architect, so that's kind of blasphemy to say, but any building that we build is adding carbon automatically. And so looking at existing buildings is huge. And I'll make a plug again for the event that's coming up on May 31st on embodied carbon, because it's part of this dialogue that isn't really it's just starting now to be discussed, to understand how much energy it takes to go into these buildings. We need to make sure when we're retrofitting these buildings that we're not using materials that are using more energy to make than we're going to save in the near term. We are seeing a growth. This is New Building Institutes is seeing a growth in the number of zero energy buildings in across the country. This is going through 2008, 18, and it's a hockey stick, right? And it's across all different buildings types. So it's possible. It's growing exponentially. Net zero energy, zero net energy, zero energy. We use these terms as the same. They're not all exactly equal, but for the purposes of our conversations here, we use all these terms. There are a lot of different people who are or organizations that are defining what it means to have a zero energy building. These are all ones that come out of the International Living Futures Institute. There are more. USGBC came out with their zero certification, and there are more coming. And so just to say that when we talk about zero energy, having these certifications is good. We need to know what they're talking about. A little bit less than a year ago, we held a roundtable. We had, I think, about 80 folks from different municipalities looking at zero energy buildings. We asked, what zero energy initiatives do you have in your town? And these are things that came up town by town. And the dots that's where people came from. This isn't all inclusive of everything that's happening, but this is just to show that there's a lot going on across the Commonwealth in terms of these kind of efforts. And we asked them what their future goals are in terms of zero energy. We also did two things. We asked them, what's their number one barrier to zero energy? And you can see, is this a pointer somewhere here? I can't do it. Okay. This, upfront cost. The number one barrier that these people in the room from different municipalities said to zero energy buildings is cost. Anyone surprised by that? We also looked at, there was in 2009, a ZNE task force in Massachusetts who looked at ZNE, and they also looked at barriers. And lo and behold, a lot of the barriers are the same and come across. And so we also looked at what people think are the biggest opportunities, what's going to help us get across to more zero energy buildings. And the number one thing was changes in our code. So we started talking about a zero energy code. And so knowing that the biggest obstacle, or at least the perceived biggest obstacle to ZNE buildings is cost, we said, well, we should address that, because our hypothesis or theory is that that's a perception and not reality. And so I will say that there are a number of other studies that have looked at the cost of zero energy buildings across the country. These are just some of them. We highlight some of them in our report. And so we have put together a report. As I said, it's about to come out on the zero energy buildings in Massachusetts saving money from the start. And in this report, we are debunking the myth that zero energy buildings have to cost more. It's possible to do them and for them not to cost more money. I'll say that we did this report with help from Integral Group, the consultant we worked with, Daedalus, provided some of our cost estimating. A number of people on our board helped as volunteers, including Rebecca and others. So it's been a real team effort. So first, just a couple of definitions for those of you, so we're on the same page. Energy use intensity. I was at Belmont, had a town meeting recently. Was anyone else there on the high school going on in Belmont? Anyone there? It was amazing. Jacob Knowles, one of the local engineers, coordinated a whole bunch of people to show up at this town meeting where solar to get the high school, they're building a new high school and they want it to be zero energy, and they're going through value engineering, right? Value, and the zero energy was on the table. And I was thrilled when I was at this meeting where the head of the committee was actually talking about EUI. I mean, 5 years ago, you'd never have the head of a building committee know what EUI is. So energy use intensity, just for short, this is site energy use intensity, is you take up all the energy that your building's going to use and then divide it by the gross building area. And this is a common term that gets thrown around now when we're talking about energy use and energy efficiency and getting to zero energy. So what do we do? Well, first, our definition of zero energy is to take a typical building. So let's say that typical building has a EUI, energy use intensity of 27. Then we do all of the energy efficiency measures that Rebecca was outlining in her report to these buildings, including primarily the envelope, the HVAC system, the hot water, lighting, and plug loads. And then and we can reduce energy down by about half. So we have going from a EUI, energy use intensity of 27, we can get down to about 13. And we're calling that zero energy ready. Right, so you have, and then from zero energy ready, if you wanted to make it zero energy, well, then you have to have renewable energy. Right, and the renewable energy for our definitions can either be completely on-site or a combination of on and off-site. So the methodology in terms of getting to this question about what's the cost of zero energy buildings in Massachusetts, and I'll break this down a little bit further. We looked at 6 building types. We were limited in scope, so we chose 6 building types, existing office and new office. So we did choose one existing building, K through 12 schools, mixed use residential, retail and residential, small family and single family, residential. We tried to get a broad range of building types in Massachusetts. And we did the energy exercise. These were all using energy models. We also used Energy Plus and looking at what would be that typical building, how low could we get it to be zero energy ready, and then how much, this told us how much renewables we needed to then make up and whether we could make it up on-site or off-site. Just in general, it was a general rule of thumb that a building under 6 stories generally could meet the demand with solar on-site. A building over 6 stories would definitely have to do a combination of on and off-site. So for these studies, we looked at how much could you put on-site using rooftop, not assuming of suburban, assuming that you only had the space on the roof, and then looking at what you would procure off-site to offset the rest. And then here's the big thing, is looking at cost. And what we need to do is think about cost, not just we need to look at the first cost, and then in addition, changing the conversation to think about the life cycle cost. I'll say preview, in all instances, these are great investments. And that if we're not doing this, it's not smart. It's just not a smart use of our money. And so what we looked at, what we found was that the cost for the initial to make these buildings, remember I said you have your first cost, and these first costs, again, were given to us by Daedalus. These are buildings in Massachusetts for each of these building types. And then looking at what would be the cost to make these buildings zero energy ready. And what we found was that it's anywhere from 0 to 7%, depending on the building type. And this came from other studies that have been done and examples that have been built in Massachusetts, high efficiency buildings that have been done in Massachusetts. So then from there, for the majority of the study, we focused at this 5% line and looking at, okay, well then we know how much renewables we need to buy. We then took out what are all of the amazing incentives. There are so many incentives. Rebecca was naming some for heat pumps that we have in Massachusetts. How much energy would we save? What are the renewable energy credits you can get? And then looked at what is that break-even year and the dollars saved. So we did this for 6 building types. So for each building type, I'm not going to go through them all right now, but so for existing offices, for instance, we had what's the baseline, how much PV. So for this, it would be 10% PV on site. What would be the zero energy ready, energy use intensity, and what's that energy savings. So for the majority of these buildings at, as I said, 0 to 7% added cost, you can cut your energy use by 53%. Now the modeling that we did not actually go back and optimize the design. So it wasn't, we didn't go back in and change the amount of glass or optimize the glass. It was really one shot, let's put all these things in and see how low we can get. And across the building types, it was about 50%. You can ask me what's the difference between 0 to 7%? What makes that difference? Well, all depends. And Rebecca actually mentioned a bunch of them. Sure, you can build an all glass building, but what she said was if you want to build an all glass building, you've got to increase the, by building an all glass building, that's more expensive than a building that has a 30, 40% window to wall ratio, right? If you want to put in an all glass building, the more glass you put in, well, the more high efficiency glazing. We have a glazing rep here, and that glass gets more expensive. The higher efficiency of the glass, the more expensive it is. So there you're increasing the cost. The more glass you have in the building, the more systems you're going to need. You're going to need perimeter, radiators, et cetera, right? So a lot of it, the cost comes down to design, and it comes down to designers knowing how to design. It's about starting building green, and we reference this in our report. Building Green has a report that talks about all these different factors. And number one is decide you want to do this from day one. This is a goal from the start. Then the whole design team, including the contractor, is on board. One, if you decide when you're in construction documents that you want to do this, you're going to be fighting an uphill battle and you're going to have to pay more money. We also, in the report, referenced there was a study that SMMA put out about glass, referencing a lot of what Rebecca talked about. Payette has an amazing tool that balances glass and comfort and cost to optimize the amount of glazing on a facade. And we reference all of those in the report. So in these, you can see we, as was suggested, we electrify and get rid of the gas, right? And you're seeing that the energy use, right, is going down significantly. And then you're going to offset with PV, and then there should be a line here that's showing you're going to buy the rest of the PV from offsite. Then for each building type, we also look at the life cycle assessment. We look over the cost over time and look at the payback. These, again, are all at the 5% increase, so they can actually look a lot better than this. So 5% cost increase for zero energy ready. It could be 0. And even within here, you're looking at a payback of 6 years. That it's going to break even within 6 years. This is just one of the examples. We did go through, and we give this to you in the report for all the building types, looking at what their typical baseline is, what the zero energy ready is, percentage of PV on site, energy savings, and then looking at what that payback period is for all the building types. And this is the bottom line of the report, comes in looking at those in terms of looking at those payback periods. It could be as low as 1 year. The average is about 10 to 15 years, depending on, again, that first cost. And if so the whole message here is to, as Rebecca's saying, talk with your design teams, figure it out now, talk with your engineers. There are engineers in town who know how to do this. A lot of you are in this room, and get them on your team. Rebecca and I have almost the same slide. And we highlight a number of case studies in the report. These are some of them. We've referenced a lot of these buildings in terms of getting this cost data, but there are examples in Massachusetts. This is one in Massachusetts, the Sprague Center. Ironically, I was actually on this team when it started, and I since left. And when I first got there, they said, no way, we're not going zero energy. And then the school decided that they signed the president's climate commitment. And they said, well, every building that we build now is contributing to our carbon emissions. So we need to figure out how to make a zero energy building. And they were able to do that. At first, they had a high performing building, but they completely redesigned the systems at no added cost to make it zero energy, and actually ended up saving money. And this building is now actually performing better than it was designed to do. So the examples exist, they're out there, and I'll report will be out soon. I'm gonna pass it on to Gabby because she's gonna talk about Passive House.
So I'm Gabby Aitchison. I work at Icon Architecture as an architect and sustainability leader. I run the sustainability committee with my coworker, Michelle Apigian, who many people know in this arena. And we're both certified Passive House consultants. So I'll be talking about how Passive House is a tool in designing a carbon-free Boston. And the presenters before me really set me up very well for this. So some of my early slides will just be reiterations of what they've said. Passive House is what we consider to be the highest energy standard. It's obviously one of many, but it's one that is focused on reducing energy loads by dramatic amounts. And that's why we feel it's such a great tool for carbon-free Boston. And this again showing what our goals are as a state and of course as a city, and how we're going to get there, how we're going to reduce 80% by 2050, or as the mayor is proposing to be neutral. And we're at a critical juncture. What we do today will impact our future. Sea level rise is happening, and we have control over how much it's going to impact us. Buildings are a huge piece of that. Again, this is sort of a summary of what we've been talking about here earlier. And we have the tools really already today to make a huge reduction in what we're consuming. So Passive House is compared to LEED quite often, but it's hyper focused on energy consumption and indoor air quality. And in that way, it's not as much of a holistic approach as LEED is. It's not point-based. It's really metric-driven. So the number one goal is to minimize the load. Once you can do that, and I'll go through the steps of how you get there, you can start to use renewable energy. And at the end of the day, you can get to net zero energy, or really start to go net positive with this approach. And this is sort of our building process across the years. We didn't used to have HVAC systems, so our envelopes were much more efficient because that was how we kept the indoor temperatures to be more comfortable. And then once technology caught up and we were able to use those more, we kind of lost sight of how to really design efficiently. So I find Passive House sort of a combination of a really smart envelope and then using the technologies we have to give us an indoor air quality and a temperature that makes sense. So the metrics, this is sort of my favorite part of Passive House, is that it's driven by testing and reporting and solid numbers. So the number one thing is really decreasing the heating and the cooling demand. Heating and cooling makes up 50% or more of what is actually being consumed in the building. And so that's the number one, and that's measured in EUI as was described earlier. Then air tightness. We actually measure through blower door tests how much leakage is going through the envelope. And that means that our buildings are more durable and resilient at the end of the day. And then overall energy demand, and that sort of translates to our carbon footprint, knowing how much energy per square foot and per person is being consumed by your building. And touching again just on how EUI works, you have site EUI, which is how much your building consumes, but you also have to take into consideration source EUI, which is how much energy it takes to get the energy to your building. So Passive House looks at both. It'll give you a metric of both source and site EUI. This graph is showing some metrics from New York City from source EUI. That's why the numbers are pretty high, getting up into the 200s. And Passive House standard is around a 38, whereas some of these multifamily residential in New York Cities are up in the 100s. So it's a dramatic reduction. The distillery was mentioned earlier. That is one of our buildings in South Boston, completed a couple years ago. We actually have utility data on that and are analyzing how that's performing, and it's doing great. Concord is what I'm going to talk. Concord Highlands is another multifamily housing project that is under construction right now. And that's what I'll be talking about in this presentation. Now, it is new construction, but all of these things that I'm mentioning today can be applied to existing buildings as well for deep retrofits. And these are the benefits. I feel like I'm just reiterating what was said earlier. You get a reduced carbon footprint, higher quality environment, lower utility bills for life. It's much more resilient. Without power, the buildings can maintain a temperature for days, even in cold winter. So the benefits are real. So this is Concord Highlands. It is a 98 unit, 100% affordable housing project near Alewife in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The developer is HRI, also out of Cambridge. It's a 6-story podium construction development. And I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit more here on this project. So when you are designing for Passive House, you use an energy modeling called WFI to give you a report card on how your building is performing. It'll tell you based on the air tightness level that you need to then measure as you're building, how your heating demand, load, and cooling demand and load are doing. And then, as I mentioned before, the source energy and your site energy. So for Concord, we're in the low 20s, whereas the national average from 2016 is about 80. So again, a pretty dramatic reduction. And I'm going to go through how we got there. So there's really 4 tenets to Passive House. The first 2 are the most important, and those are what you as a designer are really going for. And those are going to have the biggest impact on reducing the loads. So first, of course, is thermal control. This is not something new, but just to look at what that really means in a building of this size. It is multifamily, so the R values aren't crazy. The wall has an R27. That's with 2 inches of continuous insulation. R50 roof. The one thing that's a little bit abnormal is the slab is an R23. That's because it's not on the ground. We have a level of parking. So we've got about 6 inches of rigid insulation over a concrete slab. And that's maintaining this robust thermal envelope. And of course, we've got this great thermal envelope, but we're puncturing it with holes. So we've got to make sure that our glazing system is robust as well. We're using a European style window, triple glazed, with about an R7. And now that's dependent really on the climate and density, but you definitely want to make sure you have a very high performing window. And then thermal bridging. So you've got this perfect box, but in reality, you have all these little things that you need to keep your eye on, make sure that the envelope continues to perform well. So at the exterior cladding, we used Cascadia clips instead of just a metal Z-girt so that it's not metal to metal contact. We have some steel that's going from conditioned space to exterior space and making sure we have some sort of spacer there. It's not just metal to metal. And the same with the sunshade attachments. We have some using various products to have something in between the metal and the header. And of course, things come up during construction. So Concord Ave is due to be completed in January 2020. So we're mid-construction and things are coming up, things we missed. And I forgot to mention earlier, WGBH can be really helpful in determining exactly how much insulation you need. So it's a great cost benefit analysis tool, whether or not you need 2 inches of continuous or you need 3 or 4. On the flip side, once you get into these nitty gritty details, therm is also a great tool for that. We have been looking at different things that we missed. We have a column going from the garage, which is not conditioned to a conditioned space, and looking at how much insulation we really need to make sure we are not getting condensation and that we're not the thermal bridging isn't as great. And another condition, we have a concrete slab going from conditioned space to unconditioned space, and therm is great to just dial in how much insulation we really need. And we also did a cost benefit analysis on the shading. We used WGBH to test different shading strategies. We determined that putting it on the east and the west facades really didn't have a big impact, so we put the money on the south where it was, and it's going to have impact on occupant comfort as well. So then we've got this thermally perfect, right, envelope, and then we have to make sure that the air isn't leaking. That's what we consider the unsung hero. It's a huge proponent to passive house. So this is sort of the in a perfect world, you have, of course, transitions to the roofs and the walls and the slab, and then again at the windows, making sure everything's airtight there. But in reality, it's a lot more complex than that. You really have to take a close look at the transitions. So Concord is a bit complex, unfortunately. We've got some weird transitions. And so we've put this together for ourselves and for the contractor. On the right is sort of an overview, how the compartmentalization between the units works, where our thermal boundaries are in the garage and on a typical floor. And then through conversations with the contractor, we went through and we color-coded the different air barrier products that we're using to make sure that we're all on the same page of compatibility and just how the transitions are working. So this is sort of a snapshot of those more in-depth details. And it's challenging. It's definitely something you have to have in mind from the early stages. You have to be on the same page as your contractor, be mindful of this and design simpler geometry. Certainly that'll get you pretty far in this world. This is one of 15 pages of compartmentalization drawings that we have in our set, and then we've been working through with the contractor. So you've got the thermal control and you've got the air tightness. And so that means you've got sort of a thermos basically at the end of the day, and it's going to dramatically reduce your loads. So the next piece is the mechanical systems that are going in. So of course you have this airtight envelope. You need to bring in fresh air for the people living there, and that is done through energy recovery ventilators, and these will be running 24/7. So the more efficient, the better. These are so we have 2 central ERVs at Concord, and so the shafts for those are labeled in blue. 2 for supply and 2 for return. And then each unit has its own heat pump, and that's highlighted in orange. And make sure that you are designing these to be for the reduced loads that you will have because of such an efficient envelope. And also these are electric systems, which we've been, talking about, really going electric to be more efficient on the grid. So the heating and the cooling, individual heat pumps in each unit. They're on a VRF system, which means each unit has its own in-unit equipment, but then the condensers on the roof are grouped, which also saves lots of space on the roof. And it's a more efficient system that can simultaneously heat and cool across the building. And so hot water is kind of the final piece. We consider it the next frontier. Once you get your heating and your cooling loads so dramatically down, your hot water ends up being 30% of your utility. So we have a gas-fired system here. We're hoping to go electric. So at this scale, it's not really feasible right now. But that's sort of the next frontier. And then the last piece, everything going into the building, right? So this is kind of like the low-hanging fruit, things people have been doing already, but it's still really critical to make sure lighting is LED, you have Energy Star appliances, make sure you're educating your occupants on how important plug loads are with these super efficient buildings. It's sort of the wild card. And then renewables, plan for them, don't rely on them. At Concord, because we're using the VRF system, we have all this space on the roof. So we are doing solar PV panels as well. Those are highlighted in blue. And that just gets us further to net zero. So we talked a little bit about costs, and you will be spending more money on the envelope. You will be putting more money into the insulation and better windows and how to get there. And these are more aspirational, thinking long-term, making sure you know the life cycle of the building, thinking more about the embodied carbon, knowing what incentives are out there. Concord Highlands is using the Mass CEC Passive House Design Challenge, which is a huge help. And social equity as well. Know who you're building for, and why you're doing it. This is definitely something that you need to think about through the details early. We designed Concord Highlands Passive House standards and then decided later on to go certified, and we're still sort of bridging the gap a little bit. But it's something that everyone needs to be working together from the beginning. That should be true of all projects, of course, but especially with Passive House. And the contractor should really know the standards you're holding them to. The details of continuous installation and air tightness require a certain level of craft. And, test along the way. Once you get a floor of ducts in, test it. Don't wait till the whole building's in to start finding leaks. And continue to do so once people are living there as well. So this is sort of a snapshot just of all the labor of love, right? Icon Architecture are the architects. We're using Peterson Engineering, who have done a number of passive house buildings. NEI as the general contractor. This is their first passive house building, but they are invested. We go once a week and we talk through all the passive house details. They brought a certified builder onto their team. We have, of course, an energy model and the official passive house consultant. We have a verifier. The owner has a sustainability consultant. We have an envelope consultant. We have a commissioning agent. We're all working together on this. And this is just sort of a snapshot, the contractor and us trying to work through one of those tricky details, looking at it in 3D, thinking about the sequencing, thinking about the transition between materials. It's not something they're going to send to their subs, but it was a really good way for us to talk through how we're going to complete just really difficult details. And this is the same slide again, but it's worth reiterating just all the benefits that you're going to get through such a high performance building, and how it's a really great way to get to carbon neutral. And that's it from me.
Other questions for Gabby or for anybody else who's presented today? Yes.
Thank you very much. I wanted to just mention another part of the conversation that is starting is the embodied carbon and the materials. And when we get into thinking about what materials we use to thermally protect our buildings, we have to answer, that it's a hard question. Some things that we cannot change right now, but we should push our suppliers and the people who are smart enough to make these materials to find things that have low embodied carbon.
Thank you, Craig. And actually, as several of the speakers said, the other part of this is how much carbon is emitted from all the materials that we use. The United Nations estimates that 22% of all greenhouse gas comes from building materials. So if we use this much carbon to create low carbon buildings as opposed to this much carbon, it's so much better for us, especially in the urgency of this moment. So on May 31st, we're going to be addressing this with an all-day symposium. We have many of the people from the University of Washington, the Carbon Leadership Forum coming, as well as engineers and manufacturers. So we hope that all of you who care about what we're doing to our environment and how we're building will join us on May 31st. So thank you again for the plug.
I think that's a very great point because it speaks to the whole concept of negative emissions that I talked about at the beginning of my presentation. It's better to, I think, use the biomass that we might be able to produce, whether it's primarily wood in this case, for construction rather than burning it and calling that renewable energy, because in a lot of cases it isn't.
Great, thank you.
I'll respond to that a little bit too. There are a number of manufacturers, I'll name a couple, USG, Kingspan, who are really focusing on these issues to reduce the embodied carbon of their materials. Also there are tools for architects to make this less daunting. I know BR plus A I saw a presentation they gave at Greenbuild a couple of years, or maybe last year, a couple of years ago, using a tool called Tally, which plugs into Revit, and there are others. I think we're trying to schedule a class on Tally, but there are tools that exist to help architects start to understand how to weigh embodied carbon into their decision making.
So I have a question about, is this on? About incentives and policies for incentives, and Eric touched on it, but I'm wondering whether you predict any increases in incentives, especially for retrofitting existing buildings.
Yeah, I think it's a critical part of the equation. It's if you look at adoption, it's driven primarily, at least in the commercial space, by payback, right? And lengthening that payback window with the financial incentive. Shortening that payback window with the financial incentive will spur adoption. I think one of the challenges that we're also seeing in the residential space is knowledge, lack of knowledge. It's not only just getting people to writing them a check. It's also getting them the knowledge that they give them the knowledge that these programs are available, that they have benefits, that they can be done or can be integrated with a complete system replacement. Just from personal experience, we went through a furnace replacement about 5 years ago in my own home. Worked with the Mass Save program, got some nice rebates, but it was an onerous, frustrating process to go through all of that, and we need to figure out ways of smoothing that process up.
Yes, I mean, I think moving forward, so they're just into a new 3-year plan. I believe that's coming into effect. So every 3 years they re-envision what that incentive structure looks like. So I do think that there will need to be changes. It has been primarily high ROI things. So a lot of the lighting retrofits have been done. A lot of the fuel switching has been done. And we are going to start to see, it is the longer payback items. But what is available now, there's alternative energy credits, and you should go to the website, the state website, to actually see what is applicable under there. So that's where the air source heat pumps come in. They now have a multiplier if you're doing passive house and all electric. So it's like I think you should, it basically multiplies your incentive. So they're like doubling incentives for that. So there is a new year three-year plan out there. They're still not incentivizing window replacements though, but the installation's still there.
Yeah, I will say I also have personal experience on the residential side. My primary experience is not as an architect, is more on the commercial side and institutional. From personal side, I just did a full renovation of my house. I went full 100% electric. It was a house that had window units for air conditioning. So we went 100% electric. And I was in a program with Mass Save where they ran an energy model of my house before and after, and then also getting funding from Mass CC. So between those two programs, I'm getting $7,000 back. So it's much more than the two that you were talking about. And then also 100% of the lighting in the house, which is probably over $1,000 worth of lighting. So it's my understanding it's not too, it's, they'll pay for insulation. I think it's 75 or 80% of the cost to insulate your house. I think it might depend on which municipality you're in and which program, but I know that both the combination of the utilities and Mass Save are really looking at how to improve their programs on a regular basis. And so it might be who you're talking with and what's happening, but there's more money out there to be found. Yeah, that's true. And that's true. And that's something that, yeah.
May I add something on the subject of incentives? Yesterday, Mass CEC launched a whole home air source heat pump pilot program. And it's available to both new construction and retrofits. I have some details with me if you'd like to talk to me afterwards. And the other point on incentives is that yes, we do need them, and that speaking up to your elected officials can also be helpful in ensuring that these programs are continued and expanded. So don't use those resources for the long term as well.
Thank you. And do we have, I think we have one more question, I think. And then afterwards, there might be time to mingle and talk.
Hi. My question is there some centralized source of information? The building I live in recently had to replace boiler and chiller, et cetera, and the architecture committee hired the wrong mechanical engineers, and I don't think we got what we shoulda, coulda, woulda. It would be really nice. I mean, a lot of people here, professional, et cetera, but building management, even architecture committees don't always know where to look for all the best information, and various firms will tell you that they will do things that are energy efficient. It would be nice if there were, I know in Cambridge they used to have a resource for homeowners where you could go and find out who was certified, who was qualified, and get help.
The Mass CEC probably would be one of the best places to start in terms of programs and information around the space. I think town by town, there's been a number of programs. I know in Somerville and certainly Cambridge and the city have some city-specific programs that are out there that help certain tiers of guidance. And I think just hopefully, coming to events like this and connecting with people in this rooms like these is always a good place to start. But it is a big challenge. I mean, I speak about my experience, and we had a contractor who was well rated, but left a gaping hole in our ductwork outside of our envelope. And so these things pop up, and we just need, and that's why I emphasize we need a better trained workforce, more information available to our building owners. And this needs to be a place where we step it up as well.
Thank you. And thank you, Meredith and Michael and Gabby and Rebecca. And thank you to Amy and the Green Ribbon Commission. Thank you all for being here today and joining us in this learning. This was a really fantastic presentation and a great sharing of information. And I hope we just all continue to keep spreading the word and talking with each other, clients, and everyone out in the greater Boston area and beyond. And we hope to see you all May 31st over at MIT. Thanks very much.